Welcome to the deep dive. This is where we take really complex stuff and try to make it engaging, make it click. Today we're jumping into something truly massive, a real historical turning point, the French Revolution. We've gathered some fantastic source material that'll give you a real shortcut to understanding how this single event reshaped not just France, but really inspired change across the whole world. Think of it as finding the blueprint for the modern age. So let's get into it.
It's a great topic because, it wasn't just politics. It was like a foundational earthquake. It laid down these core ideas about liberty, equality, government, ideas that are still bouncing around today, still shaping our societies.
Absolutely.
We'll see how a nation's desperation really lit a fire that changed, well, pretty much everything.
Okay, so our story kicks off in 18th century France. On the surface, it looks incredibly opulent, glittering,
Yeah.
Versailles and all that. But underneath, things were shifting. Big time. So when Louis XVI takes the throne in 1774, he inherits a kingdom basically teetering on the edge. Our sources paint a pretty stark picture. What state was his treasury actually in? And I guess more importantly, why was it so empty?
Well, Louis XVI found a treasury that was, frankly, empty, completely bare. But the real insight here, I think, isn't just, bad luck or mismanagement. It was a symptom of this incredibly rigid feudal system. It just couldn't adapt. The sources show a kingdom bleeding money, not just from long wars or that incredibly extravagant court at Versailles, but from this fundamental inability to tax its wealthiest citizens, the nobles, the clergy.
Right.
So it was almost designed to fail financially, wasn't it? No matter who was king.
Wow. It's kind of staggering to think about inheriting that scale of debt, knowing it's a crisis just waiting to explode. And crucially, this financial strain, it wasn't shared equally, was it? Before 1789, French society had those rigid divisions, the three estates, clergy, nobility, and then, well, everyone else. So the big question is, which estate carried basically all the weight? Who paid the taxes that were supposed to be funding this bankrupt state?
Yeah, and that really shows you the built-in unfairness, doesn't it? It was like a ticking time bomb. The burden fell almost entirely on the third estate, the common people.
They were around.
Exactly. They paid direct taxes, like the tail. That was a state tax. And then a whole load of indirect taxes on everyday things. Salt, goods.
Stuff you need to live.
Precisely. And what's absolutely crucial to understand is that the wealthy first and second estates, the clergy and nobility, they were largely exempt.
Unbelievable.
So the people least able to pay were propping up the entire system. You can imagine the resentment that built up, deep simmering resentment.
Okay, so you've got this huge financial pressure, this massive inequality, and then you add in the most basic human need, food, bread. Our sources show that between, 1715 and 1789, bread prices just kept climbing rapidly. What was going on there? What caused this critical shortage that made even basic bread unaffordable for so many?
Well, it boils down to a fundamental imbalance, really, supply and demand. The production of grain just wasn't keeping up with a population that was growing quite fast.
Right.
So imagine the very bread on your table, the absolute staple of your diet, getting scarcer and more expensive almost day by day.
It's not abstract economics then, is it?
Not at all. For the average person, this was a daily struggle for survival. It pushed families deeper into poverty, into hunger. It basically turned the population into a tinderbox just waiting for a spark.
So you've got this cauldron, really. Economic misery, social injustice, actual hunger. And into this mix, new ideas start bubbling up. But it wasn't just the poorest people who were unhappy, right? Which specific groups within that third estate started getting wealthier, getting educated, and actually began thinking about, a different way, envisioning an end to all these privileges?
Yeah, this is where the sort of intellectual engine of the revolution starts to rev up. It was mainly the middle class, a really diverse group, actually merchants, manufacturers, lawyers, government officials.
Bourgeoisie.
Exactly. They weren't born into privilege like the nobility. They'd often gained their status, their wealth, their education through their own work and intellect. And they could see the inherent unfairness of the old system. Critically, they also had the education, the tools to actually articulate a different vision for society.
Based on merit, not birth.
Precisely. Based on merit, equality, challenging that whole idea of birthright.
And they weren't just making this up in isolation. They had intellectual heavyweights backing them up, right? Thinkers like Montesquieu.
Yeah.
His big work, The Spirit of the Laws. It proposed a key political idea. What was that, and why did it hit such a nerve?
Montesquieu proposed something truly revolutionary at the time. The division of power within government, splitting it between the legislative, The lawmakers, the executive, the ones who carry out the laws, and the judiciary, the courts.
Separation of powers.
Exactly. And this wasn't just some dry administrative suggestion, you know? It was a direct, profound challenge to the absolute power of the monarch.
Right.
It argued for checks and balances, specifically designed to prevent tyranny and protect individual freedoms. It offered a real, concrete alternative to the king having all the power.
Okay, so these powerful ideas are circulating among the educated middle class. But how do they actually jump from, philosophical texts and discussions among the elite to actually reaching and, well, igniting the ordinary people of France? It had to spread somehow, didn't it?
Oh, absolutely. That's key. The real spread, the acceleration of these ideas didn't just happen in academic circles, not at all. They really seeped into society through vibrant salons.
Right, those gatherings.
Yes, and bustling coffee houses, which were like informal public forums, really, places for debate. And they were spread widely through a huge increase in books, pamphlets, newspapers.
So literacy was spreading, too.
Yes, and the appetite for news and ideas. It meant these challenging concepts about rights, about power, captured the imagination of a much broader audience, not just the elite. It created this informed, restless, and increasingly demanding public.
The stage was absolutely set. Confrontation felt inevitable. But there was this moment of, perhaps, hope. The king, Louis VI, was forced to do something unprecedented in living memory. He had to summon the Estates General. What exactly was this body which hadn't met for ages? And what was the crucial, audacious demand the Third Estate made when they finally got there? A demand that, when Louis rejected it, really pushed France over the edge.
The Estates General was this traditional representative assembly. But here's the amazing thing. It hadn't been called together for over 170 years.
Wow.
Yeah, precisely because French kings feared it could challenge their absolute authority. Calling it in 1789 was basically an admission of royal desperation. They needed money.
So the Third Estate arrives.
Right. And seeing their sheer numbers, they represented the vast majority of the population. They made a radical demand. They insisted that voting should be done by the assembly as a whole. One person, one vote.
Instead of the old way.
Exactly. The old way was one vote per estate, which meant the first and second estates could always outvote the third, 2-1.
Rigged from the start.
Pretty much. So the Third Estate's demand was about fairness, about actual representation. And Louis VI's rejection of this, well, he feared losing control. It was a catastrophic miscalculation. It really alienated the Third Estate completely.
That rejection sounds like lighting a fuse.
Mm.
So what did the representatives of the Third Estate do next? This was June 20th, 1789. What significant defiant action did they take?
They made an incredibly bold, symbolic move. They found themselves locked out of their usual meeting hall, so they gathered in a nearby indoor tennis court at Versailles.
Right, the tennis court oath.
That's the one. They declared themselves the National Assembly, basically saying, we represent the nation now. And they famously swore an oath not to break up until they had drafted a constitution for France, one that would limit the king's powers.
So this wasn't just a protest anymore.
No, this was a direct claim of national sovereignty. Power comes from the people's representatives, they were saying, not just from the king.
And this defiance,
Yeah.
it didn't stay confined to meeting halls, did it? Things escalated quickly into open rebellion in Paris. July 14th, 1789. There are rumors swirling the king's going to use the army against the citizens. And then comes this iconic event, the one everyone knows, the storming of the Bastille. Why that particular building? Why was it so hated? And what did its fall really mean?
Well, the storming of the Bastille, it's incredibly symbolic, even though, funny enough, they only found 7 prisoners inside when they took it.
Really? Only 7?
Yeah. But the Bastille itself was this ancient fortress right in the heart of Paris. It stood as this powerful, grim symbol of the king's absolute despotic power. Arbitrary imprisonment, lettre de cachet.
So its fall wasn't just about freeing prisoners.
Exactly. It wasn't really a strategic military victory. It was a massive psychological triumph. It showed ordinary people that the seemingly untouchable power of the old regime could be challenged, could be torn down. It sent a shockwave through the monarchy and the aristocracy.
The momentum, once it started, seems like it was just unstoppable.
Huh.
Louis XVI eventually had to back down, didn't he? He recognized the National Assembly. What happened next on the night of August 4th, 1789? Something that fundamentally ripped up the old social structure.
Right. After the king conceded, the assembly held this incredible, dramatic overnight session, August 4th. And they passed a series of decrees that effectively abolished the entire feudal system.
Just like that.
Pretty much. Feudal dues owed by peasants to landlords, the special privileges of the nobility and clergy, like tax exemptions, unequal rights, all swept away, at least on paper. It was a massive dismantling of centuries of ingrained inequality, a huge tangible victory for the revolution's core principles.
Okay, so they've torn down the old system. Now they have to build something new. The National Assembly gets to work on that Constitution they promised. What was the main goal of the Constitution they finally drafted in 1791?
The core aim was to put those Enlightenment ideas, especially Montesquieu's, into practice. To limit the powers of the monarch, France was still technically a monarchy then, and assigned distinct powers to the legislative, the executive, and the judiciary branches.
Creating a constitutional monarchy.
Exactly. A radical shift from the old absolute rule. It was an attempt to lock in liberty, to prevent future tyranny through a system of checks and balances.
But, and there's often a but with these things, even as they're trying to build this new France based on liberty and equality, the dream wasn't quite universal yet, was it? This 1791 Constitution had limitations. For instance, who actually got the right to vote? Who counted as an active citizen? Wasn't everyone, right?
No, definitely not. And this really raises that important question again about how equality was actually defined on the ground. Who did it apply to? Under the 1791 Constitution, only men over 25 years old who paid a certain amount in taxes equivalent to at least 3 days' wages for a laborer were considered active citizens and got the vote.
So poorer men were excluded.
Yes. Poor men, servants, and crucially all women were designated passive citizens. No vote.
Right.
It highlights how even revolutionary movements can initially replicate existing power structures, leaving many people, many voices still excluded.
And during this period of intense change, symbols became incredibly powerful, didn't they? Ways to communicate big ideas quickly. Our sources mention one representing strength and unity. What was that symbol and what message was it sending?
That was the bundle of rods, or the fesces. It's an ancient Roman symbol, actually. The idea is simple but powerful. A single rod is weak, easily snapped, but bind a bundle of them together and they become strong, unbreakable.
Strength in numbers.
Exactly. It symbolized that individual citizens might be vulnerable, but united as a nation, they possess formidable strength and resilience. It was a call for solidarity. It's a symbol that's popped up many times in history since, sometimes in less positive contexts, too.
True. Okay, so the revolution isn't standing still. It's getting deeper, more complex. Those initial reforms, the constitutional monarchy, they weren't enough for some. A really powerful political club emerges now, led by someone who had become almost synonymous with the next, more radical phase, who was leading the Jacobin Club. And what were those Jacobins called who wore those distinctive long striped trousers?
The most prominent leader of the Jacobins was Maximilien Robespierre. And those members, often from the working classes of Paris, who wore the long striped trousers, deliberately rejecting the fancy knee breeches, the culottes, worn by the aristocracy, they were known as the sans-culottes.
Literally without knee breeches.
Exactly. They represented a much more radical populist force within the revolution. They weren't just pushing for political reform. They wanted deeper social and economic change, more equality. They were a driving force behind the push towards a republic.
And this revolutionary fervor, it even created music that captured the moment, right? A song that became a national anthem.
That was La Marseillaise. And it wasn't just a catchy tune. It became this incredibly powerful anthem of liberty, a call to defend the revolution against its enemies, both internal and external.
Still gives you chills, doesn't it?
It really does. It captured the passion, the defiance, the spirit of the revolutionaries so effectively that it spread like wildfire and became this enduring symbol of French national identity, still is today.
So the push from groups like the Sans-Culottes and the Jacobins continues. And the revolution reaches this critical point where the monarchy isn't just limited, it's abolished entirely. When exactly did the newly elected convention declare France a republic? This was a massive step, cutting ties with centuries of kings.
That truly monumental shift happened on September 21st, 1792. France was officially declared a republic. The monarchy was gone.
Wow.
This was a huge deal in Europe, completely dominated by kings and emperors. It sent absolute shockwaves across the continent. It was seen as a profound threat by the old monarchies.
Okay, but here's where the story takes a much darker turn, doesn't it? It shows maybe the dangerous side of revolutionary passion when it gets out of control.
Sure.
What was that period from 1793 to 1794 known as? The time characterized by Robespierre's policy of really severe control and punishment.
That was the infamous Reign of Terror. It was a period of intense political repression. The Committee of Public Safety, led largely by Robespierre, aimed to crush any perceived opposition to the revolution. Anyone deemed an enemy of the Republic.
And they used extreme measures.
Yes, very extreme, including widespread arrests, summary trials, and thousands of executions, most famously by the guillotine. It's a really stark reminder that revolutions, even those started with high ideals like liberty and equality, can descend into terrifying authoritarianism and violence.
And this control extended even to the most basic things, like food. How did Robespierre's government try to enforce equality when it came to just eating bread?
Yeah, it's quite extraordinary. They actually passed a decree forcing all citizens to eat what they called pain d'égalité, equality bread.
Equality bread.
Yes, a standard loaf made from whole wheat flour. The use of expensive fine white flour, seen as an aristocratic luxury, was strictly forbidden. It was this radical, almost symbolic attempt to eliminate class distinctions even in the most basic act of eating, to enforce equality through controlling sustenance itself.
But this kind of relentless, severe policy, this climate of fear and suspicion, it couldn't last, could it? What ultimately brought Robespierre down? What led to his own execution? It seems the revolution started to turn on itself.
Exactly. His policies became so extreme, so unforgiving. He targeted former allies, colleagues, eventually even his own supporters within the convention started demanding moderation. They feared they might be next.
The paranoia grew too much.
Yes. There was a growing sense that the terror had gone too far, that it was undermining the revolution's own principles. So his opponents managed to rally support within the convention, had him arrested, and he himself faced the guillotine. The revolution, as you said, began to devour its own. It shows the inherent danger and instability of unchecked power, even revolutionary power.
So after the terror ends and Robespierre's gone, France needs a new way to govern itself, trying to avoid the extremes of monarchy and the terror. What was the Directory that was put in place? What was its purpose?
The Directory was a new executive body set up after the fall of Robespierre. It consisted of 5 members, 5 directors. They were appointed by 2 elected legislative councils. And the main purpose, really, was to try and create stability and prevent the concentration of power in one person's hands, which everyone believed had led to Robespierre's excesses.
A deliberate check and balance.
Yes. They wanted a more balanced, hopefully more stable form of Republican government. Though, in practice, the Directory period turned out to be quite unstable itself, plagued by corruption and political infighting. It paved the way for Napoleon eventually.
Right. Okay, let's shift focus slightly. Beyond France's borders, the revolution's ideas are having a huge impact, especially on things like human rights, colonial practices. Our sources mention a really revolutionary social reform that the Jacobin regime actually implemented in the French colonies. What was that? And thinking back, what problem was the whole triangular slave trade response to in the first place?
Well, the really significant reform was the abolition of slavery in all French colonies, decreed by the convention in 1794 during the Jacobin period.
Wow, that early.
Yes, it was genuinely radical for the time. And it connects back to the triangular slave trade. That horrific system had developed primarily because there was a massive demand for cheap, forced labor on the sugar, coffee, and indigo plantations in the Caribbean colonies like Saint-Domingue, modern Haiti.
Because Europeans wouldn't work there.
Exactly. Europeans were reluctant to go and work in the harsh tropical conditions and do that brutal labor. So the trade in enslaved Africans was the horrific solution to that labor shortage. So the Jacobins' abolition, driven by the revolution's ideals of universal rights, was a truly progressive, though sadly temporary, step.
Okay, temporary is the key word there.
Yeah.
Given this back and forth, when was slavery finally and permanently abolished in the French colonies? It clearly wasn't a straight line.
No, not at all. It's a complex and quite painful history. Napoleon actually reinstated slavery in 1802, largely due to pressure from planters.
Unbelievable.
Yeah. So despite that initial abolition, the fight continued. Slavery was finally, and this time permanently, abolished in all French colonies in 1848.
Decades later.
Decades later.
Right.
It really shows the persistent struggle required to achieve lasting human rights reforms, especially when powerful economic interests are involved.
Okay, back in France itself, beyond the big political shifts, those ideals of liberty started filtering down into everyday life, didn't they? What was an important law that came into effect pretty soon after the Bastille fell in 1789? something that dramatically changed public discussion and the spread of ideas.
That would be the abolition of censorship.
Ah, freedom of the press.
Exactly. Declared in the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen, it meant, theoretically at least, the free flow of ideas. Newspapers, pamphlets, books, plays, they could be published and circulated much more freely, openly discussing events, criticizing the government.
That must have been a huge change.
Oh, massive. It led to an absolute explosion of public debate and opinion. It was unprecedented and played a huge role in shaping the course of the revolution itself and, setting a precedent for future struggles for free speech.
But again, speaking of liberty and rights, that promise of equality wasn't extended to everyone. We touched on voting rights, but women faced other exclusions too. Who was Olympe de Gouges? And what tragically happened to her when she dared to criticize the Jacobin government, particularly for closing down women's political clubs?
Olympe de Gouges was a truly remarkable figure, a playwright, a political activist, really outspoken. She saw that the revolution's promises weren't being applied to women, and she wasn't quiet about it.
She wrote her own declaration.
Yes. Famously, in 1791, she wrote the Declaration of the Rights of Woman and Citizen, deliberately mirroring the official declaration, but including women explicitly. She argued passionately for women's rights to education, property, political participation, but when she criticized the Jacobin regime, particularly Robespierre, and protested their suppression of women's political clubs, well, that was dangerous.
What happened?
Sadly, she was arrested, tried by the Revolutionary Tribunal for treason, essentially, for challenging the regime, and executed by guillotine in 1793.
Wow.
Her fate is a really stark and tragic reminder that revolutionary movements, even those claiming universal rights, often had very clear limits, and women who stepped outside prescribed roles could face severe consequences.
And what was the fundamental difference between that original Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen and her Declaration of the Rights of Woman?
The key difference was explicitness. Her declaration deliberately mirrored the structure and language of the original but replaced man with woman and man, or explicitly stated that women possess the same natural, inalienable rights as men.
Including political rights.
Yes, including the right to participate in making laws and holding public office. She argued that if women could be punished by the law, they should also have the right to help make the law. The original declaration, despite its universal-sounding language, was implicitly understood by most at the time to apply primarily, if not exclusively, to men. Olympe de Gouges' work really throws that limitation into sharp relief. It forces us to ask, again, who gets included when we talk about universal rights? It's a question we still grapple with, isn't it?
Absolutely. Okay, so the revolution goes through the terror, then the Directory,
Yeah.
which you said was unstable. And then emerging from all this chaos, this military and political turmoil, comes this towering figure who takes charge and reshapes France and indeed Europe all over again in 1804, who crowns himself Emperor of France. And what was his final destiny in 1815?
That, of course, was Napoleon Bonaparte, a brilliant, ambitious military general who rose through the ranks during the Revolutionary Wars. He staged a coup overthrowing the Directory, became first consul, and then in 1804 famously took the crown from the Pope and crowned himself Emperor of the French.
Quite a statement.
A huge statement. From republic back to empire, but a very different kind of empire. His ambition led him to conquer vast swaths of Europe, spreading some revolutionary ideas like legal codes, administrative reforms, even as he imposed his own rule. But his ambition ultimately overreached. His final defeat came, as we know, at the Battle of Waterloo in 1815.
The end of an era.
The end of his era, yes. He was exiled, and the map of Europe was redrawn once again. But the impact of both the revolution and Napoleon lingered profoundly.
So let's pull back and look at the big picture. What does all this upheaval, this violence, these ideals, what does it all mean for the wider world looking beyond France? What were the really crucial, lasting legacies of the French Revolution that spread across Europe in the 1800s? And did those ideas travel even further?
I think the most important legacies, the ones that truly echoed, were the core ideas themselves. Liberty, equality, fraternity, popular sovereignty, democratic rights. These concepts became incredibly powerful inspirations across Europe throughout the 19th century.
Fueling other movements.
Absolutely. Fueling nationalist movements, people wanting self-determination for their own nations. Fueling calls for constitutions, for limiting monarchical power, for expanding voting rights. Spurring liberal and radical movements everywhere. And yes, these ideas definitely crossed oceans. Our sources specifically mention figures in India, for example.
Really? Like who?
Individuals like Tipu Sultan, the ruler of Mysore, and later the social reformer Ramahan Roy, they responded to the ideas coming out of revolutionary France. They were particularly interested, it seems, in the ideas of liberty, freedom from bondage, which resonated in a colonial context, and the whole concept of the nation and popular sovereignty.
That's fascinating to think of these revolutionary concepts traveling all that way, sparking thought and debate in such different contexts.
It really shows how powerful and adaptable these core ideas were. They weren't just French ideas, they became global currency in the language of political change.
What an incredible journey we've taken. From, the empty royal coffers of Louis XVI through the storming of the Bastille, the radicalism of Robespierre and the terror, and then seeing how these shockwaves, these ideas spread out across the globe. We've really unpacked a lot today, seeing how those seeds planted centuries ago are still part of the foundations of how we think about freedom, about government, about human rights today. It truly is a deep dive into the messy, complex, but vital way history unfolds.
It absolutely is. And if we connect it all back, the French Revolution, I think, powerfully shows us that real fundamental change is often incredibly messy. It can be violent, frightening, full of contradictions. But the ideas it unleashes about human dignity, about rights, about who holds power, those ideas have an unbelievable potency. They can resonate for centuries, inspiring people in ways the original actors might never have imagined. It really makes you wonder, doesn't it, about the ideas we're debating, the seeds we're planting today. How might they shape the world centuries from now? And crucially, for whom will that future world be better? The echoes of 1789 are still prompting questions, I think.